secrets, my loves, that do not whisper, they wound. They hide in plain sight, carved into ordinary things, waiting for the right trembling hand to lift them into light. In Hawksmere, that secret took the shape of a wolf, a small wooden creature born of desperation and defiance. It carried not teeth, but truth. And truth, once unburied, has a way of devouring its masters. You see, faith can crumble, but guilt endures. Father Clement walks the narrow path between salvation and damnation, clutching his proof like a relic and a curse. Lady Alianor, bound in silk and silence, learns that obedience can become its own rebellion. And Bess, trembling and brave, dares to move against the current of terror that rules the keep. This, my darlings, is how revolutions begin, not in thunder, but in whispers, not with swords drawn, but with hands that refuse to remain still. In Hawksmere, a single carving carries the weight of justice, and even the smallest act of courage can tilt the scales of fate.
Chapter 11. The Carved Wolf. Lady Aurelia Ravenshade unmasks Hawksmere's deadliest secret proof, betrayal, and a spark of rebellion. The carved oak wolf, nestled deep within the oiled cloth bundle hidden beneath Father Clement's coarse woolen robes, felt less like wood and more like a live coal burning against his chest. Each step he took along the rutted track, leading away from Thorn's Hollow, seemed to amplify its weight, its dangerous significance. The desolate beauty of the hidden valley, with its skeletal winter trees and brooding standing stones, receded behind him, replaced by the suffocating, invisible pressure of Roland de Mowbray's expanding shadow. He clutched his worn leather satchel tighter, not against the biting Derbyshire wind that whipped strands of graying hair across his face, but against the icy dread seeping into his bones. Proof. The word hammered in his mind, relentless and terrifying. Proof etched in the intricate lines of the leaping wolf. Proof crusted onto the heavy gold signet ring bearing the de Mowbray bore. Proof that Eamon Thorne had been innocent of the theft that shattered his life years ago. Proof that Roland de Mowbray was not just ambitious, but monstrously deceitful, capable of framing an innocent man to remove an obstacle. And proof that, if discovered, would be a death warrant for anyone who held it. Clement's breath hitched, forming thick plumes in the frigid air. He glanced nervously over his shoulder, half expecting to see Mowbray riders cresting the ridge, drawn by the sheer treasonous weight of his secret. The landscape was stark, empty, beautiful in its bleakness, yet every shadow felt watchful. Roland's grip on Hawksmere was no longer just political, it was visceral. His men were ubiquitous, patrolling the village lanes, lounging with predatory ease outside the miner's tankard, their presence a constant, low thrum of implied violence. Sister Marjorie's pious gaze missed nothing, her network of whispers as effective as any spy ring. And Alianor. Clement's heart clenched with a pain that was both grief and guilt. Trapped within the stone walls of Hawksmere Keep, bound to her tormentor in a grotesque parody of marriage, her spirit seemingly extinguished under Roland's calculated cruelty, her body, Bess had tearfully implied, was a nightly sacrifice demanded to ensure the maid's continued breath. The image Clement carried of Alianor during the wedding ceremony, a pale ghost in poisonous green samite, her eyes vacant pools reflecting only desolation, haunted him. It was a sin of omission he felt stained by. His silence, his fear, felt like complicity. He couldn't return to St. Agnes Priory. Marjorie's instincts were too sharp. She'd scent his turmoil, his dangerous knowledge, like a vulture circling carrion. The miner's tankard was a crucible of gossip, bubbling with Roland's informants and Marjorie's eager ears. His own humble cottage near the church felt suddenly exposed, its flimsy door offering no barrier against Roland's ruthlessness. He needed solitude, sanctuary, a place to think and pray for guidance that felt increasingly distant, drowned out by the roar of his own fear. He veered sharply off the main track, his boots crunching on frost-hardened earth heading towards the small, forgotten chapel of St. Cuthbert. Nestled in a copse of ancient, gnarled yews on the farthest edge of the neglected de Clairvaux lands, the chapel was a relic of a more pious, or perhaps simply less desperate time. Moss clung thickly to its north-facing stones. Several roof slates were missing, letting in gray fingers of light and the relentless damp. Pushing open the heavy, warped oak door was an effort, met with a protesting groan of neglected hinges. Inside, the air was thick with the smell of mildew, decaying wood, and the faint, sharp tang of mouse droppings. Dust motes danced in the weak light filtering through the high, narrow windows. The stone altar was chipped, the simple wooden cross above it leaning precariously. It was a place of profound neglect, a physical manifestation of faith eroded by hardship and fear. Yet, it offered a fragile sanctuary from watching eyes. Clement sank to his knees before the altar, the cold of the flagstone striking through his worn trousers like a physical shock. He bowed his head, clasping his hands tightly, his knuckles white. He tried to form words of prayer, for guidance, for courage, for protection, but they crumbled like dry clay in his mind. Instead, the faces crowded in. Aemon's quiet intensity as he tended his herbs, the flicker of wary intelligence in his eyes that spoke of hidden depths, Alianor's rare, fleeting moments of unguarded curiosity in the forest clearing, the spark of defiance that had blazed so brightly and been so brutally extinguished, Roland's cold, triumphant gaze, the absolute certainty of his power, and Bess's terrified whisper, "So much blood." The weight of the hidden bundle against his chest was an insistent, accusing pressure. Proof. But proof for whom? And at what cost? Within the oppressive stone embrace of Hawksmere Keep, the gilded cage had solidified into a tomb. Alianor moved through her days with the eerie, precise movements of a marionette whose strings were pulled by invisible, cruel hands. Dawn brought not hope, but the crushing weight of routine. She broke her fast in the cavernous great hall, seated beside Roland at the high table. The air smelled of wood smoke, damp stone, and the bland oat porridge she forced past lips that felt numb. Roland ignored her presence for the most part, engrossed in discussions with his hawk-faced steward, Osric. "The output from the West Gallery increases, Sir Roland," Osric reported, tapping a ledger with a bony finger. "But the men complain of seepage. It slows the work." Roland sipped his watered wine, his gaze fixed on the figures. "Complaints are the currency of the lazy, Osric. Quotas must be met. Double the shifts if necessary. De Mowbray's expansion cannot be hindered by damp." His voice was calm, utterly devoid of concern for the men toiling in the dark, damp earth. He finally glanced at Alianor, his eyes sweeping over her with detached appraisal. "You look fatigued, my lady wife. Is the chill of the hall too much? Or perhaps the weight of Hawksmere's recovery?" His solicitous tone was a razor wrapped in silk. He offered his arm as they rose. "A brief walk on the battlements will invigorate you." His fingers closed around her forearm, not guiding, but possessing, digging in subtly through the layers of her sleeve. She walked beside him, her steps measured, her gaze fixed on the worn stones beneath their feet. The wind, on the battlements, was a knife, slicing through her woolen kirtle and cloak. Roland paused, ostensibly to admire the view, the stark winter-bare hills rolling towards the horizon, the skeletal woods, the distant plume of smoke from the lead works. Alianor saw none of the harsh beauty. Her eyes registered only the Mowbray guards patrolling the walls below, their movements synchronized, their eyes constantly scanning the countryside, the bailey, her, reporting, always reporting. "Magnificent, is it not?" Roland murmured, his breath warm against her chilled ear. All this potential, dormant for so long under weak stewardship. Soon it will all bear the de Mowbray standard. His hand tightened on her arm, a physical punctuation mark. "Your prosperity is assured, Alianor, bound to mine." Later, in the solar that had once been a quiet refuge for Lady de Clairvaux, now smelling of Roland's clove pomander and unfamiliar beeswax, Alianor presided over household accounts. It was a hollow pantomime. Osric presented ledgers showing dwindling Hawksmere resources, inflated expenses for security and improvements orchestrated by Roland, and the meager trickle of income from the estate's few remaining tenants. The figures painted a picture of utter dependence on de Mowbray coffers, ignoring the systematic plunder of the lead mine that flowed directly into Roland's coffers. Alianor signed where Osric indicated, her signature a shaky scrawl on the parchment. Her quill felt like a branding iron. Roland's public courtesy was a weapon, meticulously honed. My lady wife approves of the new Flemish tapestry in the antechamber? He might ask, gesturing towards a garish hunting scene depicting a boar cornered by hounds. A trifle extravagant, perhaps, but necessary. Hawksmere must reflect its revitalized status under strong leadership. The extravagance, she knew, was paid for by ore, extracted through the suffering of miners whose hovels Roland planned to demolish. You seem withdrawn today? Alianor? Is Bess neglecting her duties? I can have her reassigned if she troubles you. The casual threat, veiled as concern, hung in the air, freezing the blood in her veins. She would force a brittle smile, murmur assurances about Bess's diligence, her heart pounding against her ribs like a trapped bird. At night, the blade of Roland's control turned inward, piercing the fragile armor of numbness she struggled to maintain. He came to her chamber with the grim inevitability of the tide. There were no words of affection, only the silent expectation of submission. His touch was not intimate. It was a clinical inventory, a nightly reassertion of ownership that left her feeling flayed, hollowed out. She had learned the art of dissociation, retreating deep within the fortress of her own mind. She focused on the rough texture of the linen sheets against her cheek, the intricate pattern of frost etching the window pane in the moonlight, the mournful, distant call of a vixen, anything to distance herself from the violation of his body on hers, the grunting exertion, devoid of anything but dominance. She became adept at stillness, at silence, at making herself an empty vessel. The only emotion permitted to surface was the raw, primal terror for Bess, which flared white-hot every time Roland's gaze lingered on the maid, every time his voice held that particular glacial edge. That terror was the unbreakable chain binding her shattered will. One blustery afternoon, under the watchful, beady eyes of Agnes, Roland's newly installed head housekeeper, a woman whose loyalty was as solid and unyielding as her stout frame, Alianor was subjected to the ritual of inspecting the linen stores. The air in the narrow storeroom was thick with the scent of dried lavender and dust. Agnes moved with officious efficiency, unfolding sheets, commenting on thread counts and mending needs, her voice a monotonous drone. Bess, pale and silent, followed behind, refolding items Agnes deemed acceptable. As Alianor passed a towering stack of neatly folded table linens, Bess momentarily blocked Agnes's view. Her shoulder brushed against Alianor's arm. The contact was fleeting, but Alianor felt something small, hard, and unmistakably shaped pressed into her palm. Her fingers closed around it instinctively, her breath catching in her throat. She didn't dare look at Bess, who immediately bent to adjust a pile of napkins. Her head bowed so low, her cap obscured her face, her hands trembling visibly. Alianor kept walking, her pace unchanged, her expression carefully blank, despite the frantic hammering of her heart against her ribs. She waited until she was momentarily shielded by a massive, linen-draped cupboard at the far end of the room, Agnes's attention momentarily diverted by a perceived moth hole. Uncurling her fingers in the shadowed space, she looked down. Nestled in her palm was a tiny, crudely carved wooden bird. A sparrow, wings folded close. The work was simple, rough in places, but imbued with a sense of life, of watchfulness. It was unmistakably Eamon's work. The kind of thing he'd whittle absently by the fire, a moment of quiet creation amidst his solitude. A wave of emotion, so powerful it threatened to buckle her knees, crashed over her. Disbelief, a fragile, agonizing hope, crushing grief, and a fierce protective need to shield this tiny symbol. He lives? Did he carve this for Bess? Or for me? Or was this merely Bess, clinging desperately to a memory, a talisman against despair? The tiny bird felt simultaneously like a shard of ice piercing her heart and a spark of defiant fire against the encroaching darkness. Proof of a connection that refused to die, or a cruel reminder of everything irrevocably lost. With trembling fingers, she slipped the sparrow into the small hidden pocket Bess had sewn into the inner seam of her kirtle next to her skin. It nestled there, a secret heartbeat against her own. Later, enduring Sister Marjorie's presence in the solar, the nun had arrived to discuss the upcoming feast of St. Agnes and the essential need for a substantial donation from the new Lady de Mowbray. Sir Rowland's reputation for piety, my dear, reflects upon us all. Generosity is expected, a visible sign of gratitude for his stabilizing influence. Alianor found her fingers straying to the spot where the wooden bird lay hidden. Through the layers of fabric, she traced its rough outline, its folded wings. It was a tiny anchor in the suffocating sea of Marjorie's insinuating piety and veiled threats. The nun's sharp eyes missed little, the shadows beneath Alianor's eyes, the stiffness in her posture, the way her gaze sometimes drifted towards the window, towards the hills, but they missed this small, silent rebellion pressed against Alianor's heart. The sparrow was hers, a secret Rowland couldn't touch, yet. The miner's tankard heaved with the low thrum of uneasy life. Smoke from the peat fire hung thick in the air, mingling with the sour tang of spilled ale and unwashed bodies. The wedding feast had been dissected. Rowland's power acknowledged, with the grudging acceptance born of fear. But beneath the surface of forced jollity and ale-fueled boasts, dangerous currents swirled. Old Tom, the blacksmith, his massive forearms resting on the scarred table, slammed his empty tankard down. Aye, they found it all right. Thorne's place, days after the ruckus in the square. Mowbray's wolves, noses to the ground. He spat expertly into the rushes near the hearth. Tore it apart, they did, like dogs after a fox. Davy, his face prematurely lined, his cough a wet, rasping thing that echoed in the brief silences, nodded grimly. He'd worked the lead since he was 12. The rock dust was in his lungs, shortening his breath and his life. Looking for summat specific, weren't they? Or just making sure the fox weren't coming back to its den? He took a long, shuddering pull of weak ale, trying to soothe his ravaged throat. Making sure. More like. Will, a younger miner with fire in his eyes but fear in the set of his shoulders, muttered darkly. He leaned forward, lowering his voice, though the two Mowbray men lounging near the door seemed engrossed in a game of dice. My cousin Ned works in the stables. He saw it. The night they dragged Thorne off, after the noise stopped. Will swallowed hard, his gaze flicking towards the guards. They dragged Summit out, covered, in sacking, heavy. And the cobbles? Saints preserve us. They were dark, slick. Even after they sluiced it down next morning, you could see the stain, like rust, but thicker. He shivered, though the tavern was stiflingly warm. The tavern keeper, Harold, a portly man whose joviality had been worn thin by fear, slammed a fist down on the bar, making tankards jump. Enough of that talk, Will Cooper. I'll not have it. Not here. We've trouble enough without summoning more with loose tongues. He glared pointedly at the Mowbray men, who glanced up briefly, their expressions bored but watchful, before returning to their dice. Alianor, the baker's wife, her plump face creased with worry that went beyond the price of flour, piped up from a corner table where she huddled with two other village women. What of her ladyship, then? Seen her yesterday, riding out with him towards the works. Looked like a ghost walked over her grave, she did. Pale as whey, jumpy as a cat in a kennel. And her eyes? Alianor shook her head, wrapping her shawl tighter. Empty, like someone blew the candle out inside. Sister Marjorie, who had chosen that precise moment to sweep in, alms box clutched like a shield, sighed, with practiced, world-weary piety. Ah, the poor, burdened soul, she intoned, her voice cutting through the murmurs. She paused dramatically, drawing all eyes. Lady Alianor bears a heavy cross, Her unfortunate entanglement with that dangerous outlaw brought such scandal upon her house, upon herself. A near-fatal lapse in judgment, fueled by grief and a vulnerable spirit. She shook her head sorrowfully, her eyes sweeping the room, gauging reactions. Sir Roland, in his boundless Christian charity and strength, shoulders the immense burden of restoring her reputation, her stability, and the fortunes of Hawksmere itself. A trial for any husband, however blessed by God's grace he may be, she moved towards the bar, placing a few thin copper coins into her alms box with a pointed clatter. Pray for her soul, good people. Pray fervently for her complete submission to God's will and her husband's wise and benevolent guidance. Only through humility and obedience can she find true peace. Her words, delivered with the weight of divine authority, were masterful. They painted Alianor as a broken, penitent sinner and Roland as a long-suffering saint, effectively smothering any flicker of sympathy or suspicion about her haunted state. The narrative was set. Roland the Savior, Alianor, the redeemed sinner, Aemon, the deservedly erased villain. Father Clement, after hours of agonized pacing and silent pleas in the cold, desolate chapel of St. Cuthbert, knew the time for prayerful inaction had passed. The carved wolf and the heavy ring felt like millstones, dragging him towards a precipice. Fear was a physical presence, cold sweat prickling his skin, despite the chapel's chill. But the image of Alianor's deadened eyes, the memory of Aemon's quiet dignity, and the damning weight of the ring in his pocket coalesced into a conviction stronger than terror. Silence now was a greater sin. He couldn't approach Alianor directly. Roland's web of watchers was too dense, too vigilant. Bess was the only fragile thread connecting the outside world to the prisoner in the keep. He needed to get the carving to Alianor. Not the ring. That was too volatile, too easily traced, its origins too damning. But the wolf? Aemon's message carved in oak, his plea, his declaration of connection. It was a spark, a tiny, dangerous spark, but perhaps the only thing capable of piercing the suffocating numbness that encased Alianor's soul. A spark that might ignite something or consume them all. He chose the hour of the wolf's retreat, the pre-dawn grayness, when the world is hushed, suspended between night and day. The air was knife-edged cold, the frost on the dead grass crunching loudly underfoot, making him wince with every step. He knew Bess's routines, born of years of quiet observation and his own care during her illness. She sometimes slipped out to the small, walled kitchen garden just before dawn, under the thin pretext of gathering herbs for the day's cooking. Parsley, thyme, perhaps a few hardy sage leaves. It was a habit formed when her cough was bad and the cool morning air offered relief, now a potential, perilous lifeline. Clement huddled in the deep, freezing shadow cast by the stable wall, his breath pluming in thick clouds. He pulled his threadbare cloak tighter, shivering uncontrollably, not just from the cold, but from the enormity of what he was about to ask of the terrified maid. He scanned the mist-shrouded bailey. The guard on the gatehouse walkway was a dark, indistinct shape, hopefully numb with cold and boredom. The keep itself loomed, a brooding silhouette against the gradually lightening sky. Then he saw her, a small, slight figure, barely more than a shadow itself, slipped through the postern door near the kitchens. Bess she carried a small wicker basket. She moved with agonizing slowness, pausing after every few steps, her head turning constantly, scanning the bailey, the walls, the stable block, like a hunted creature. Her fear was palpable even across the distance. Clement waited until she reached the first row of dormant rosemary bushes, their gray-green fingers dusted with frost. He took a deep, steadying breath that did nothing to calm the frantic pounding of his heart and stepped out of the shadows. "Bess," he whispered, the sound barely louder than the sigh of the wind. She whirled around so fast she almost stumbled, a small, choked cry escaping her lips before she clamped a hand over her mouth. Her eyes, wide as saucers in her pale face, scanned him in the gloom, filled with pure, unadulterated terror. For a heart-stopping moment, He thought she might scream. "Father Clement," she gasped, her voice a strangled whisper. "Saints preserve us. You near stopped my heart." She pressed a hand to her chest, breathing rapidly, her gaze darting past him towards the guard tower. "Forgive me, child," Clement murmured, moving closer, but keeping his voice low enough that it wouldn't carry. He could see she was trembling violently. "I had no choice. I must speak with you. Is she watched? Even now? At this hour?" Bess nodded jerkily, her eyes still scanning the Bailey. "Always, Father. Always. Agnes. That housekeeper Roland brought. She's his eyes inside. She notes everything. Who comes, who goes, how long Milady sits, what she eats." Bess's voice dropped to a threadbare whisper. "And he watches her like a hawk watches a mouse. Even when he's not looking, you feel his eyes." She shuddered. Clement's heart sank like a stone. The risk was even greater than he'd feared, but there was no turning back. He reached into the deep pocket of his robe, his fingers numb with cold and fear, closing around the small, hard, familiar shape of the carved wolf. "Listen to me, Bess. Listen carefully. This is vital, more vital than anything." He leaned closer, his voice barely a breath. "You must get this to Lady Alianor, without anyone seeing, especially not Agnes, especially not Sister Marjorie, especially not any of Roland's men." He pressed the small oak carving into her cold, trembling hand. "Hide it." Instantly, Bess looked down at the object in her palm. Even in the weak, pre-dawn light, the shape was clear. A wolf, captured mid-leap, muscles coiled, fierce and alive. The carving was unmistakable. Amon's work. Her breath hitched audibly. She closed her fingers tightly around it, feeling the sharp edges bite into her skin. Is it from... She breathed, unable to utter Amon's name, her eyes flying back to Clement's face, filled with desperate hope and renewed terror. "I found it," Clement said evasively, his own gaze darting around the Bailey. "Hidden, in a place meant for sanctuary." He paused, choosing his next words with extreme care. "It's a message, Bess. For her, for Lady Alianor. It might be the only thing that can reach her now." He struggled to articulate the fragile, terrifying hope the carving represented. Tell her it was found where sanctuary was offered. Tell her the earth remembers." He was thinking of the ring, buried, hidden, then uncovered. Truth, like seeds, could lie dormant, but not die. "Can you do this, Bess?" His voice was raw with urgency and fear. "Can you get it to her, unseen? Can you find a way?" Bess closed her fingers even tighter around the carving, its fierce shape a tangible piece of defiance in a world ruled by fear. It felt like holding a sliver of Amon's unbroken spirit, a whisper of the truth Roland was trying so desperately to bury. She looked from the small, potent object in her hand to Father Clement's earnest, fear-etched face, then towards the immense, shadowed bulk of Hawksmere Keep, where her lady endured a living death. The terror was a physical weight, threatening to crush her. Discovery meant torture, meant death. For her, certainly for Alianor, likely for the priest. But the tiny wolf felt like a key, perhaps the only key, to a prison door. It was a dangerous spark, but without it, the darkness was absolute. She met Clement's gaze. The terror was still there, bright in her eyes, but beneath it, ignited by the fierce spirit of the carving she held, was a desperate, flaring courage that surprised even her. Her chin lifted a fraction. "Aye, Father," she whispered, her voice suddenly steadier than it had been in weeks. She didn't hesitate. With a swift, furtive movement, she slipped the carving deep into the pocket of her apron, burying it beneath the few sprigs of frost-nipped thyme she'd gathered. "I'll find a way. For Milady." Clement placed a hand briefly, firmly, on her thin shoulder. The gesture conveyed more than words. Gratitude, blessing, shared burden, and a plea for caution. God shield you, child, he breathed. Be swift as the wind. Be silent as the grave. He melted back into the deep shadows by the stable wall, disappearing from view just as the first true rays of dawn, pale and watery, began to bleed across the eastern sky, illuminating the frost on the rosemary like a million shattered diamonds. Bess clutched the hidden wolf through the fabric of her apron, its fierce leaping form, a secret rebellion, burning against her thigh. The most dangerous hour had dawned. The spark was past. The fire, or the inferno, would follow.
And so, the wolf has been passed from one trembling hand to another, its carved body carrying more than wood and prayer, it carries prophecy. In that small hidden act, the course of Hawksmere shifted. The wheel began to turn. The walls that imprisoned her began at last to crack. They will say she was meek. They will say she endured. But I tell you, endurance is the first language of vengeance. Beneath her stillness, Lady Alianor breathes the air of awakening. Father Clement holds a secret that can unmake an empire, and Bess, poor frightened Bess, becomes the messenger of ruin. The wolf runs now, not through forest or field, but through hearts that have been silent too long. Its shadow grows with every breath of defiance, every stolen act of grace. The truth is coming, my loves. And when it arrives, it will not knock softly.